Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Turnip's Digest. I am joined today by a full panel of John from Knights of Dissent. How are you, sir?
Very, very well.
Very good. Grant Brooks, how are you doing?
Doing well. How about you?
I'm doing pretty well. It's bright and early, but not nearly as early as some of our guests are here. And Mr. Prudentialist, back from appearing on the first episode or two. How are you doing, sir?
Happy to be back, Mr. Turnip Seed. It's always great to talk to you.
Yeah, fantastic, and it's always great to have you here, especially for this topic, since this might be of interest not just to you, Mr. Prudentialist, but everyone, American or not, because today we're going to be talking about the foreign policy of the neoconservative movement, and this might be a little simplistic. Some people might see that I have Jeane Kirkpatrick up on the screen right now. And think that this is a bit oversimplified, that there might be more to neoconservative foreign policy. But once again, I'd like to remind everyone from the last episode that this is this and a couple other selections that I don't think I'll be covering were included in the essential neoconservative reader that I have here on my desk. And this is specifically under the section on foreign policy. And to be perfectly honest with you guys in the panel and the audience, I think this is a pretty good summary or an essential piece in neoconservative foreign policy literature. I don't think this would be oversimplifying it to say this forms a basis of a lot of their foreign policy and diplomatic thought. I mean, unless any of you guys have anything to dispute me on that with.
No, this is a pretty seminal piece of work. You actually really do have to read this to sort of understand the motivating ideology behind neoconservatism, especially as it gets more renown in the late 1980s, early 90s, and sort of a through line that you'll see in this piece, but also if you start reading seriously into neoconservatism, is that there are these sort of varying factions. For instance, when you go back to 2003, right? I know it's like baby years for you, Turnip, but you have to understand that there was an article written by Max Boot who was asking the question, like, well, what the heck is neoconservatism? And it was like a very big piece in terms of the op-ed section of the Wall Street Journal. And they had basically laid down what neoconservatism is, not just in its relationship to Israel, which was the primary focus of what Max Boot was arguing for, but also discussing the very things that we're going to see in this Jeane Kirkpatrick piece. So I'm looking forward to reading this again. I haven't read it since college, and when I said that, Turnip replies, "Says me either." And then you have to remember that Turnip's in college, so he's got that smarminess of a young man with him. So I'm excited to get into
it. So you mentioned that the other aspect of neoconservative foreign policy is a heavy focus on Israel. When I said earlier that we probably wouldn't be covering the rest of this neoconservative reader on the foreign policy section, the other piece that is included is Ruth Wiss or Wise. I don't quite know how to pronounce the names in the half of this book. Yeah, and it's the delegitimation of Israel is the other piece that's in this foreign policy section alongside Kirkpatrick. So while I think I would like the discussion, I don't know that it would stay up on the channel if we had it. That being said, we do have Kirkpatrick here, a pretty non-heated piece, I think, for our time. I think we can only really have an intellectual discussion about this since none of these things that she's talking about are really current anymore. I don't think that I think I might have saw maybe one thing that has spilled over into the modern day, and even then that's grasping for straws. Kirkpatrick, in this piece called Dictatorships and Double Standards, her very famous article for, I believe it was Commentary Magazine, is focusing on a set of diplomatic crises at the end of during and at the end of the Carter administration. And the crises that she mentions will continue throughout his reign up until Reagan's administration, at least through the beginning or throughout it, whatever. She has seen a lot of these things emerge during Carter's administration, and she very much blames Carter and the idealists that he has surrounded himself with. This is sort of the following a theme that you might have noticed last week, where these neoconservatives will form their ideologies kind of in opposition to the things going on, but don't really have a unified goal that unites them. So last week when we were going over economics, you saw Irving Kristol appealing to these more Greek forms of political thought when dealing with the economy. You saw George Gilder kind of giving a sort of idiosyncratic but very positive moral case for capitalism, in stark contrast to the neoconservative himself, Mr. Kristol. And then we did not go over Michael Novak, who is giving a much more Catholic positive view on democracy and capitalism. If you want the gist of that we weren't able to go over last week. Similarly, in foreign policy, you'll find a lot of neoconservatives that have slightly different perspectives and interests, but they all largely coalesce around the same thing, and each one is basically formed in reaction to something bad that happened. It's not a positive political movement by any stretch of the imagination. These people did not wake up suddenly after their idealistic, usually communistic youth and say, we just really need X, Y, or Z to be achieved. They see bad things going wrong in these liberal regimes that perhaps they once might have been favorable to, and realize that something has to give. So that's my summary of the context here. If any of you three stop me if you feel like I've missed something. But with that said, I think that we're ready to jump into this. Anyone else have any sort of prelude before we move on? All right.
It's not in here, but it's important to contextualize in the midst of Jimmy Carter's administration and leading up to the 1980 election. You have rather infamously the Andrew Young affair, in which I think he's the former mayor of New York. He's a black man. Has meetings. He's nominated and he's accepted by the Senate to take the role on as the ambassador to the United Nations, and he talks to the PLO and the Palestinian authorities. Deliberately against anyone's wishes. What was treated as an accidental run-in ended up being an actual full-on luncheon meeting, and this is in the midst of the United States supporting a UN resolution about unabashed full support for Israel. And later on, does Andrew Young end up kind of becoming a sort of neocon token party guy with Reagan administration? I'm briefly summarizing it, but this also spurs a lot of neoconservatism in the direction towards the foreign policy Israeli position, but also undercuts the progressive coalition a bit, because it really breaks the last, it's one of the straws that sort of breaks the camel's back of the Black Jewish alliance. But you need to keep this in mind in the midst of reading this, as they get frustrated with their own foreign policy and how bad the world is going, because Jimmy Carter does have some positive attributes, but foreign policy is not one of them.
Right, and that, I think that most people would admit that now, looking back on it 50 years later. But and one other thing as well that might be worth mentioning before we go into this, there's the I mentioned earlier the stereotype that neoconservatives were communists in their youth. This is very true for Kirkpatrick, whom we're reading here. She was born in Oklahoma. She was a hardcore Trotskyite at a young age, and freely admits this in any of her biographical works. And this didn't give way because she had a profound change in moral ideals or something. This gave way because she thought it was impractical, that it didn't have it wasn't able to be achieved. So she had to go for the realistic option given her principles, which is I don't know, maybe telling you. Sometimes you get a few ex-leftists that have a bit of a more genuine reason why they are ex-leftists, but Kirkpatrick, as well as a lot of her compatriots, seem to very much be in the modern crop of the ex-left that we get today, where they don't really actually drop a lot of the priors, and they just continue along thinking that, well, it didn't work or it's unrealistic, so we have to try something else.
I think maybe that's one thing we should preface this with as well, that during the FDR years and World War II, you do have this, it's not just a few people. There is this whole wide movement in the Anglosphere for communists and socialists to adopt the label progressive and to style themselves as, oh no, we're not these crazy youth terrorists anymore. We're the grown-ups in the room. We're the real believers in how the world works and all that. This is a pretty key thing to understand going into studying neoconservatism.
Right, and that was pretty explicit in the last few essays that we reviewed, where Crystal himself was I think he directly said, we know how the world works and these youthful radicals don't. This is a major thing that you see with them, and to be perfectly honest, Kirkpatrick is basically employing the same diminishment and hand-wavingness against the Carter administration here. That is in fact a central motif of this piece, is that she will just hand wave away the radicalism and almost the end of history ideals of the Carter administration, if you will, to use an anachronism here, hand waving it away is just not how it works. I'm sure that everyone here sort of grew up hearing that all the time from political commentators to establishment leaders, businessmen, or whatever else. It's just not how it works. This is the central theme around a lot of neoconservative policy. So anything else, gentlemen, before we jump into this piece here? All right. So for the audience, you can divide this essay up into two halves. The first, and it is almost basically halves. The first half, Kirkpatrick is laying down a lengthy sort of a context for what is happening in the world. And then in the last half, she sort of softly transitions to talking about what has gone wrong, according to her, and advocating some sort of a change in policy, or for the vast majority of it, just critiquing the current, at the time, current Carter administration's policy. So that's the two halves of this essay. The first half is a lot of fact. It's not really disputable, and a lot of it is through a lens that perhaps scarily a lot of the dissident right might find to be very amenable. So that might be a little bit of an interesting factor there. But we'll just read out this first part here to get a taste for how this essay is going to go. Kirkpatrick writes, "The failure of the Carter administration's foreign policy is now clear to everyone except its architects. And even they must entertain private doubts from time to time about a policy whose crowning achievement has been to lay the groundwork for a transfer of the Panama Canal from the United States to a swaggering Latin dictator of Castroite bent. In the 30-odd months since the inauguration of Jimmy Carter as president, there has occurred a dramatic Soviet military buildup, matched by the stagnation of American armed forces and a dramatic extension of Soviet influence in the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, Southern Africa, and the Caribbean, matched by a declining American position in all these areas. The U.S. has never tried so hard and failed so utterly to make and keep friends in the Third World." So that's the backdrop that Kirkpatrick is starting with. Once again, something has gone terribly wrong. And this is going to be
I could think of some countries in Southern Africa that would have been good allies against the Soviet Union.
So
But
this is
I don't think the Reagan administration supported those countries.
right. So this is we're going to have to get into what actually happened, because Kirkpatrick will actually outline those nations that you're alluding to, John, and mention that it was not handled correctly, which is once again classic neoconservative rhetoric. They will look back on things that become unpopular, not necessarily failed or whatever, just people are focusing on them, and they will say, well, we didn't handle that correctly, and they will not really change or self-reflect any farther. But this is I mentioned earlier, Kirkpatrick will agree a lot with some of the dissident right, at least in how the facts are laid out. She will mention Rhodesia and South Africa rather, and the Carter administration's seeming vindictiveness against white oligarchs in these third world nations. It's just that the neoconservatives didn't actually do any better in this regard. So maybe a little bit of cause for introspection will be in order once we get to that part. So she kind of gives that very broad view, and then she goes on to single in on Iran and Nicaragua. Maybe Iran might be interesting for us, but her basic contention is going to be here in this first couple of paragraphs. Unless you guys have something specific, I think we can just summarize. Iran and Nicaragua are both being plagued by especially left-wing militants and guerrilla forces, and the Carter administration is very conciliatory towards them, because the Carter administration believes in democratizing these countries, and they're currently ruled by autocrats, so Carter and his diplomatic corps has basically been playing both sides, but favoring the left-wing guerrillas as sort of a force of democracy. Should sound very, very familiar, perhaps a little bit more subtle to some of the things that have happened in the last couple of decades. And then she's going to throw in a couple of other countries where things have been inept: Guatemala, Morocco, Zaire, or the Congo, and El Salvador. And then she's going to keep going and say, well, things keep going wrong. We're also seeing a little bit of a diplomatic play in Korea and Mexico, and the U.S. position is going to be seriously set back if things keep going the way they are. So this is sort of setting the crisis, kind of like Urban Crystal did last week in his economics essay, where he's going to play up a very large threat and then provide his own solution as the only realistic and desirable solution. So basic rhetoric at work there. And then particularly throughout this introduction, Kirkpatrick is going to be focusing on the similarities between Iran and Nicaragua, which, if most people were to look at a map or use their basic knowledge, you might think there are very little similarities between the two. But at the time, they had enough for Kirkpatrick and a lot of the more traditional aspects of interventionist American foreign policy. Iran had oil, a close proximity to the Soviet Union. Nicaragua was in our backyard, a very key interest to us. Both, however, most crucially, were being plagued by left-wing militants against their authoritarian regimes. Traditional interventionist foreign policy would basically just say, so long as the autocrat is favorable to us, we don't actually need to intervene far past that. We could influence them, we could develop them or whatever else, but we would not want to actually replace the autocrat. Post-World War II diplomatic thought, however, was trending in a direction that everyone allied with the United States had to be liberal and had to be democratic. So, if your impression before going into this video is that the neoconservatives are the ones that specifically want to democratize and liberalize the world, it might seem somewhat shocking that this key neoconservative essay, one of the first ones articulating their foreign policy, is in reaction to that. Now, regardless of what they would go on to later do, this is the cause for their existence. They view this idea of democratizing and liberalizing the world to be too idealistic and catastrophic for the American interest. So they take that a different direction than perhaps we might, where we would say it's catastrophic because it is liberal and democratic, or at least liberal in the new sense. But this is a very similar critique coming out of the neoconservatives that you might hear from a good portion of the dissidents. Does anyone have anything specific from this introduction? Because I'm thinking about just gliding through it and telling the audience that they can read this whole beginning on their own. I feel like I summarized it there. Any feedback from the panel?
Well, I think what she lays out in speaking of both of these examples and kind of the initial way that the Carter administration handles them reminds me a lot of the Arab Spring, and specifically the way Egypt was handled by the Obama administration. And in both of these cases, you're talking about heavy criticism coming from people whose essential critique is kind of, you're doing this wrong, rather than any sort of statement that the ideals themselves are the problem, which I think is interesting because in this essay, she does kind of get into anti-colonialism, not explicitly, but sort of broadly being the reason why this keeps happening. But those communist priors, I think, kind of prevent her from really being able to get at, well, why is it that whenever we try to liberalize these places that are relatively friendly to us with autocrats, instead of getting liberalized, they become like theocracies? I think that's an interesting thing to tease out here.
Right, and this will become more apparent, especially in the second half of the essay, where she will basically take for granted that democracy and liberalism, once again in the new sense, is desirable to all, but she will just disagree in the method in which it's brought about. But this is specifically something that I wanted to point out in the introduction. Because she's going to give like a sort of general theme and then say everything is a variation on this, but most of these elements are present. She's kind of giving the general story of how American foreign policy has worked in this idealistic stance. Kirkpatrick writes, the pattern is familiar enough. An established autocracy with a record of friendship with the U.S. is attacked by insurgents, some of whose leaders have long ties to the communist movement, and most of whose arms are of Soviet, Chinese, and Czechoslovak origin. Just zooming out here for a second, this is very ironic because we were talking earlier about the main geopolitical obsession of the neoconservatives. That state in the Middle East was actually first supplied by Soviet and Czechoslovak arms because the democratic West saw it to be too much of a pariah and too Soviet aligned at its inception.
Yeah, I mean, they specifically went to Czechoslovakia because they were the only one that would sell them small arms openly. I mean, there were people in the U.S. that sold them illegally, but yeah,
right,
it was
because outside of the Eastern Bloc, the Israelis have the largest stockpile of Soviet-grade munitions.
Right, exactly. And this isn't coincidental. You can hear this from other people talking about the subject directly, but the Israeli state, especially early on, was not friendly to the West. In fact, it might have been established as a specific rebellion against Britain, which is a Western power. But this is not actually relevant to Kirkpatrick's point. It's just a sort of deep irony that they are so terribly concerned about Marxist influence and support perhaps one of the most successful bankrolling by Marxists of a state, which would of course be Israel in the Middle East. But continuing along the same, Kirkpatrick continues, the Marxist presence is ignored and or minimized by American officials and by the elite media, on the ground that the U.S. support for the dictator gives the rebels little choice but to seek aid elsewhere. Violence spreads, and American officials wonder aloud about the viability of a regime that lacks the support of its own people. The absence of an opposition party is deplored, and civil rights violations are reviewed. Liberal columnists question the morality of continuing aid to a rightist dictatorship. We lost Mr. Brooks there. That's unfortunate. Sorry, we'll continue and hopefully he'll join back with us. Liberal columnists question the morality of continuing aid to a rightist dictatorship and provide assurances concerning the essential moderation of some insurgent leaders who hope for some sign that the U.S. will remember its own revolutionary origins. Requests for help from the beleaguered autocrat go unheeded, and the argument is increasingly voiced that ties should be established with the rebel leaders before it is too late. The president, delaying U.S. aid, appoints a special emissary who confirms the deterioration of the government position and its diminished capacity to control the situation, and recommends various measures for strengthening and liberalizing the regime, all of which involve diluting its power. So this is Kirkpatrick's general theme. This is what she observes as the U.S. continues to blunder its way through foreign policy, is this specific thing. You have timidness at the beginning, so potentially, according to her, you could be more hawkish and crush the insurgency with aid to these powers and just not have to deal with this, because obviously they're going to get Soviet aid and arms anyways, no matter whom we support. And then you're going to have people within your own country, the liberals, the civil rights types, whom the neoconservatives will flip-flop on, whether they support or are in opposition to them, depending on how useful they are. Once again, a common theme. And they are going to basically pressure the administration not to do anything and to cut ties with the pro-American position in the country, usually the traditionalist autocracy that is fighting the guerrillas. And then something that's going to play into their favor is that this guerrilla left-wing group is going to say, well, once the Americans were a revolutionary movement against a class of rich oppressors far away of an imperial variety. So therefore, the U.S. can't help but be hypocritical in supporting the other guys. They must support the insurgents. And then after all of that, the whole thing just deteriorates, and it's sort of seen as a foregone conclusion that the regime will fall, because we're basically Whigs in our history. So as soon as you get a movement of the people to the left, it has to succeed. That's the only thing that can happen.
It's interesting because I don't think that argument would actually work selling like foreign Marxist regimes to the public anymore. Like I don't think people believe enough in the American founding mythos for that to work. I mean, I'm sure it worked in like 1979, but I don't think you could actually do that anymore.
I think that, in my opinion, I think that's just because most people don't have a conception of historical movement anymore. I think that, ironically, reaching sort of the end of the Whig progression has kind of extinguished a lot of its energy.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like the education of like the Zoomer generation, like they don't even believe in like the like mid-century catastrophic event. Like they don't believe in anything.
Yeah, the long arc of Whig history is dementia.
Right, exactly. Like I have a feeling that if anyone made any argument about a progression of events or history, I think most people now would either not care or they would wonder why it's a foregone conclusion. Whereas, as we can clearly see with the older generations that are still exercising power today, they still very much do buy into a lot of this sort of outmoded Whig ideas of history. Not that the younger generations are against it; they just don't buy into it. So I think that is a very interesting thing to point out. The sort of atrophying at the end of history. People don't really believe in progress of history anymore. It's just kind of a maintenance of a position. And so this general theme that Kirkpatrick lays out is going to be used to discuss all American foreign interventions after World War II, basically. She's going to point out that Vietnam didn't have some of these aspects, but they had quite a lot of it. You saw quite a lot of the American left criticizing American support for a right-wing dictatorship against a group of guerrilla freedom fighters, was the typical narrative. She's going to point out that this was the case in various Central American interventions. You could even make the argument that this happened in China quite famously because certain diplomats in the United States forced a ceasefire between the two sides, which allowed the Marxist side to actually consolidate their resources and win the war. So this is this, and I would like to put special emphasis on the before it's too late aspect. The inevitability of this is going to be the driving force of this pre-neoconservative interventionist policy. So that's why I wanted to get out there. Does anyone else have anything specific before we move on from this this first quarter of the essay or so?
Notice the lack of anti-fascism.
Yeah, and that's something that I find interesting, just because she is only going to be talking in these high-minded, sort of neutral academic terms of democratic and authoritarian. I think the anti-fascism might have been added later to this foreign policy.
It's also because she's Irish and not other things.
But Mr. Prudentialist, why do you think that is? Why the lack of anti-fascism in the seminal piece, despite the fact that we know the neocons are perhaps the greatest anti-fascists in American politics?
Well, I would argue that this is sort of my, I don't want to say schizo, but this is sort of my, I guess, my attempt at maybe making a larger takeaway from it than anything else. Is that I think of the current batch of neoconservatives that have a certain axe to grind against Russia. And there's this statement that always makes me think, that was said by a friend of mine. He says, really a big motivating hatred for this isn't just an ethnic animus, but it is an anger, a punishment for making communism not work. And what else but a bunch of disaffected Trotskyites that are very upset at the current status of global communism and Marxism at this moment. So I would be remiss to not think that there might be some ideological underpinnings here that we're seeing. And you can see this in the works of other neoconservatives of this time as well, is that there is a big upset position that the Soviet Union is failing. They're supporting organizations that don't fit within our specific ideological Weltanschauung. Ergo, we must become the freedom fighters of the world. I know everyone likes to say that Hans Hermann Hoppe is the one that likes to use the words "the God that failed" in his writings, but there is an earlier book that I want to say came out in 1948 or in the early 50s called "The God That Failed," and it was a collection of essays of very prominent people in Hollywood. Producers, writers, etc., and academics that were disillusioned with democracy. And the way in which they had described it, again, was looking at the fact that, like any religion that doesn't have the answers, communism didn't have the answer either. And, but of course, when you're talking about authoritarianism, or you're talking about before it's too late, you're a hop, skip, and a jump away from phrases like "never again." And you're also a hop, skip, and a jumping away from saying that the United States did not do what was necessary to act in the defense of the liberty of these peoples. I mean, he says rightist dictatorships. Oh, I'm upset that I didn't give money to a particular leader in a certain country, and ergo, it's just like if the United States didn't give aid to the Soviet Union in World War II. It's actually really easy to make the anti-fascist connection if you wanted to, but again, we have to contextualize this, that this is within Jimmy Carter's administration, and that we're at the height of the Cold War, where there is some degree of geopolitical strategic parity for the Soviets. I mean, we can't really stress it enough in this discussion, at least in the backdrop of Jeane Kirkpatrick, right, is that at this point in time, you have an individual that is expressly concerned that the United States is in a position to lose, especially when it comes to South America and East Asia. You're in the midst of the aftermath of the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union has not yet invaded Afghanistan. It's about to, though. But at this point in time, you've got a pretty strong position in the Middle East, East Asia, and in South America. So this is really where you begin to see in the early 80s, right, a lot of American Hollywood films, Red Dawn especially, where America actually is standing alone. And that's not a good thing in this sort of global anti-communist coalition that the United States is allegedly supposed to lead. And so Jeane Kirkpatrick, and you'll see it throughout the rest of the essay, is that if the United States wishes to survive, it must be more aggressive in its anti-communist action.
Right, and this is so you have the geopolitical reasoning there, which I think that especially most people inclined towards a hawkish position, not just the neoconservatives, actually agreed with quite strongly. You could even see this in the book on the Birchers, where and Birchers were by no means neoconservatives, typically had the same view that the United States had to be far more aggressive against communism, or else it was just going to be subsumed. That is a genuine concern that people had at the time, without the ability of hindsight that we have today about how developed were the communist blocs in reality at the time. The other thing that I think it might be worth mentioning again, though, just so that people kind of have a well-rounded view of what people or of what their critics might have thought of them at the time, the neoconservative critics, is that quite a lot of them would make the case that they were just disaffected communists in their youth, and since they were disaffected, they would make everything about combating communism, either to... You can psychologize this and try to say they're making up for lost time when they themselves were communists. You could say that they became non-communists because of how terrible the ideology was and now they must oppose it, sort of like a rabid convert to the opposite side or religion. This is another aspect as well from the individual standpoint, not necessarily the ideology.
I think, though, if you read them, that's not the impression you come away with. The impression you come away with, actually, is kind of the same thing as these like disaffected liberals now saying like, oh, well, the left left me. Like a lot of these guys, their whole conception is like communism betrayed the ideals of communism. And actually, I'm the true believer in these ideals and communism can't achieve them, but I can.
Oh, well, right. The thing that I was more talking about there wasn't actually... Probably could not be applied to Kirkpatrick, though you could make an argument, I'm sure, if you dug through some of her speeches that she gave to various different diplomatic groups like the UN. But this is going to be sort of the broader movement. You're going to get a lot of like minor, especially journalists, that will kind of do this. Whether or not they're neoconservatives is up to debate, but they certainly will go into coalition with them during the Reagan years in particular. This is I don't think you can deny that for some of them. Kirkpatrick is a bit harder to read because, once again, she's using very neutral terms like autocracy, democracy, and all these other things. But before democracy perhaps might have had the connotation that it does today in terms of foreign policy. But that's just my point, or my argument there. You don't necessarily have to accept that to see what else you can find in this essay. So, after highlighting this general pattern that Kirkpatrick has observed in sort of America conceding its geopolitical position, she's going to go on and she's going to kind of take a few side shots at more or anti-interventionist elements in society, as well as concessions and all these other types, these people that are going a bit soft. She says the emissary's recommendations, the one appointed to this deteriorating autocracy, are presented in the context of a growing clamor for American disengagement on grounds that continued involvement confirms our status as an agent of imperialism, racism, and reaction, is inconsistent with support for human rights, alienates us from the forces of democracy, and threatens to put the U.S. once more on the side of history's losers. This chorus is supplemented daily by interviews with returning missionaries and reasonable rebels. So, ironically, she's pointing out a very left-wing tactic here. Something that perhaps dissidents today might point out as the United States tries to liberalize the world, is that we will get a lot of pressure from various different international groups. You're going to have a bunch of people claiming that America shouldn't be involved, not because it's not America's business or because it's impoverishing us or we're sending our people to die over there for no reason, but because it's imperialistic, it's racist, and it's reactionary. We're not being left-wing enough. We should just let the guerrillas win because they are the actual progressives over there. We're contradicting our commitment to democracy. This is a very common argument that you'll find in especially progressive or left-wing textbooks that go over American history. They will point out every contradiction with American democracy and our foreign policy, any chance that they get. And then putting the U.S. on the side of history's losers is actually a complaint that was lodged at us by quite a lot of Europeans, especially. And whether this was because they became genuine anti-colonialists after they were forced to decolonize, or whether it's because they were getting back at us or whatever else, or because they elected their own left-wingers, depends on the case. But this is usually referring to outside pressure and then our journalistic class rather than actual popular opinion. Mr. Prudentialist.
I have to chuckle at the returning missionaries and reasonable rebels. This course is supplemented by daily interviews of acceptable presenting revolutionary, rebel forces, and then liberation theology style missionaries, both Protestant and Roman Catholic. I can't help but just chuckle at that.
Oh, right, and this is very interesting as well, especially for our side. A lot of people will be familiar with the events of Rhodesia. In the interim, before it became a black supremacist Marxist state, it was actually ruled by a cleric. I believe was a black Methodist, and this would be the sort of reasonable person that they're putting up as the legitimate leader, or at least an acceptable moderate. This cleric in Rhodesia was anti-colonialist, basically a very, very much anti-white Rhodesia, violently so. But he presented a very reasonable appearance to Western powers, and he would contrast himself very skillfully against the rabid communist militants that would later take over the country. These are the kind of people that Kirkpatrick is talking about. And yeah, to be honest, these can come from all different denominations. Roman Catholic, Methodist. I would not be shocked if there were Lutherans in there, Baptists, or whomever else. You can find a left-wing missionary in any of those, especially because missionary work, especially the humanitarian aspect, attracts the left-wingers from any religious group. Quite a lot of them are humanitarians more than they are missionaries. So, yeah, this is a general trend, and you can still see this today. Who is it in the religious spheres that push the refugee services, that push the resettlement initiatives and whatever else? It's going to be the ones oriented towards missionary work. So that's a fantastic thing that I came across while reading this Prudentialist notice, and I'm sure everyone else on this panel did as well. This is a theme that you can very easily still find today, and reasonable rebels as well. The Overton window has always accepted people farther to the left than to the right, and especially journalists and the media class will push this. So this is not just a modernism as well.
Does anyone remember the John McCain reasonable rebels thing, where he took photos that were allegedly with these reasonable rebels in Syria, and it turned out they were all like ISIS?
I don't actually remember that, but that sounds like a perfect illustration of how all of this inevitably turns out. And especially in case any of the European contingent of my audience is listening, this is not you can find quite a lot of American support for whichever group you want in any of these conflicts. In fact, that's the critique launched by a lot of neoconservatives here. But something that you are going to have to remember is that, especially given our stage in the world today, with a lot of the submission of European powers to the United States, a side is going to have to be taken. So whenever you see these people posing with rebels or with traditionalist autocrats or whatever else you want to call them, or whatever side is in the conflict, it's basically par for the course. Unfortunately, we don't actually have a political movement that would be against this, and it might be worth understanding why that is. Why did Europe relinquish its diplomatic and military influence to the United States. But that's not the topic for discussion today. So. And yeah, I do have a good 40% of the audience, I think, are European listeners. So with that, though, just because I think these sets of paragraphs are very important, I would just like to read out this one right here on the screen, because Kirkpatrick's going to make a very interesting point here. She says, as the situation worsens, the president assures the world that the U.S. desires not only that the people choose their own form of government, he blocks delivery of all arms to the government and undertakes negotiations to establish a broadly based coalition headed by a moderate critic of the regime who, once elevated, will move quickly to seek a political settlement on the conflict. Should the incumbent autocrat prove resistant to American demands that he step aside, he will be readily overwhelmed by the military strength of his opponents, whose patrons will have continued to provide sophisticated arms and advisors at the same time the U.S. cuts off military sales. Should the incumbent be so demoralized as to agree to yield power, he will be replaced by a moderate of American selection. Only after the insurgents have refused the pro-offered political solution and anarchy is spread throughout the nation, will it be noticed that the new head of government has no significant following, no experience at governing, and no talent for leadership. By then, military commanders, no longer bound by loyalty to the chief of state, will depose the faltering moderate in favor of a fanatic of their own choosing. So this paragraph stuck out to me when I read this, because this sounds almost to a T like the dissident critique of U.S. foreign policy after the year 2001, 2003. This sounds like it to a T. The U.S. is a wrecking tradition. You get this here in this paragraph by replacing the autocrats with, quote, moderate critics of the regime. You get the whole incompetence at sort of nation building thing, where you get some crony or some like starry-eyed moderate from that's indigenous to the place or whatever, and you put him in charge of the country even though he has no real experience governing it. This sounds almost exactly like a dissident critique of American foreign policy, which I don't know, maybe that's cause for concern, or the neoconservatives are right. Both are on the table here, and I guess it's up to us and the audience to choose which one it is. Someone has gone wrong somewhere, though. I think, in how this foreign policy analysis is being conducted. So, to be fair to Kirkpatrick, this is pretty well how the line of events goes, where someone incapable basically is appointed to lead a country, or strongly encouraged to. This is why we don't have a U.S.-aligned democratic Iran today. It fell apart. This is why we didn't have a U.S. democratic-aligned Central America. Most of them got couped, or we couped them, or something else. To be fair to her, the facts are correct. It's just the analysis is very much parallel to what the dissidents today are talking about. And then right at the end of this section, she says, in either case, the U.S. will have been led by its own misunderstanding of the situation to assist actively in deposing an erstwhile friend and ally, and installing a government hostile to American interests and policies in the world. At best, we will have lost access to friendly territory. At worst, the Soviets will have gained a new base. And everywhere, our friends will have noted that the U.S. cannot be counted on in times of difficulty, and our enemies will have observed that American support provides no security against the forward march of history. This isn't a criticism unique to Kirkpatrick. Richard Nixon quite famously made this remark about the Shah in Iran, and I think that went viral like a week ago or so on Twitter. But this is where the dissonant neoconservative analyses kind of depart. Kirkpatrick does not like how this is going, because Kirkpatrick is very much a hawk geopolitically. Not in the sense that she just wants overt military intervention, but that she wants as much American influence everywhere beneficial as possible. And this is the main thrust of her critique now. After laying out this dismal situation, the main issue here is that we have gotten rid of our geopolitical friends, and they have been replaced by something else. And it can be anything, but it's going to be a downgrade in terms of our influence. So, this is sort of the general setup here. Does anyone have any commentary on this first part of the essay as she's describing the events and what's wrong with them? All right. So, after she lays out these chains of events, she's going to start going through various different government officials, and I think this might be worth reading out once just to show what is the Carter government doing, how are they handling these situations, what are their driving ideals. And you might find that the Carter administration is much closer to how neoconservatives are caricatured today than this neoconservative writing the essay is. So Kirkpatrick writes, "No particular crisis conforms exactly with the sequence of events described above. There are always variations on the theme. In Iran, for example, the Carter administration and the president himself offered the ruler support for a longer time, though by December 1978, the president was acknowledging that he did not know if the Shah would survive, adding that the U.S. would not get directly involved. Neither did the U.S. ever call publicly for the Shah's resignation. However, the president's special emissary, George Ball, quote, reportedly concluded that the Shah cannot hope to maintain total power and must now bargain with a moderate segment of the opposition, and was, quote, known to have discussed various alternatives that would effectively ease the Shah out of total power. There is, furthermore, not much doubt that the U.S. assisted the Shah's departure and helped arrange the succession of Bakhtiar. In Iran, the Carter administration commitment to non-intervention proved stronger than strategic considerations or national pride. What the rest of the world regarded as a stinging American defeat, the U.S. government saw as a matter to be settled by Iranians. Quote, we personally prefer that the Shah maintain a major role in the government, the president acknowledged, but that it is a decision for the Iranian people to make. And then, lest anyone thinks that this is just a full opposition to interventionism, or to non-interventionism, which I'm sure Kirkpatrick was against, that this is not the argument she's making here, because later on she's going to say that the Carter government is selectively applying non-interventionism to favor left-wing governments. That's the gist of this whole section. She's going to apply that logic that you just heard about Iran to Nicaragua. She's going to apply it to just a myriad of other countries as well, and she's going to say that this selective non-interventionism is the phrase that I believe that she uses, or selective isolationism, I forget which one it is. She's going to say that this is just a tool that's being used to benefit the left throughout the world, or Marxism, or the Soviets, and it's specifically being used to weaken American foreign policy in the pursuit of allowing this to happen. However, once we get to more right-wing nations like Iran, or Nicaragua, or South Africa, or Rhodesia, then suddenly the non-interventionism goes away, and we must democratize these countries. And to be fair, this is typically how the especially liberal foreign policy worked at the time. It just sounds a lot more like how the neoconservatives are caricatured today. Does anyone have anything on these paragraphs that they want to read out, or any commentary before we push through to Kirkpatrick's theory of democracy? Quiet panel this morning. So, Kirkpatrick's main critique here is not that democracy is bad and that's why the U.S. should not be pushing it on these countries, or that leftism necessarily is bad. Kirkpatrick's critique is that we're just not doing it correct, which I believe is the point that Grant Brooks made earlier, and other people on the panel might have as well.
You might want to read the paragraph right before, this one.
The
2 or 3 decades ago.
Okay. Well, I was yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good place to start. So, she's going to start getting into how we are doing this wrong. How are we pushing democracy incorrectly? And this is I think these 2 paragraphs particularly are quite telling. Kirkpatrick writes, 2 or 3 decades ago, when Marxism enjoyed its greatest prestige among American intellectuals, it was the economic prerequisites of democracy that were emphasized by social scientists. Democracy, they argued, could function only in relatively rich societies, with an advanced economy, a substantial middle class, and a literate population. But it could be expected to emerge more or less automatically when these conditions prevailed. Today, this picture seems grossly oversimplified. While it surely helps to have an economy strong enough to provide decent levels of well-being for all, and open enough to provide mobility and encourage achievement, a pluralistic society and the right kind of political culture and time are even more essential. And just to cap off this, the underpinnings of her philosophy, she continues, in his essay on representative government, John Stuart Mill identified 3 fundamental conditions which the Carter administration would do well to ponder. These are, quote, 1, that the people should be willing to receive representative government, 2, that they should be willing and able to do what is necessary for its preservation, 3, that they should be willing and able to fulfill the duties and discharge the functions which it imposes upon them. So, Kirkpatrick is giving this is where the neoconservatism, I think, really shines. She's saying that we can't just democratize Iran or Nicaragua or these limited democracies like Rhodesia and South Africa overnight. And they need to have the proper culture for it. They need to have the proper pluralistic mindset for it. They need to have citizens that understand and will participate in democracy, which, ironically, I think that's the mainstream critique of the 2001-2003 foreign policy interventions now from the right. Not the dissidents anymore, but the mainstream, where they'll say, we were too jingoistic, we were too gung-ho. Iraq, Afghanistan, and all these other places just weren't ready for democracy, and this is where we messed up. I think this is where neoconservatism still shines, is that sort of mainstream impulse to just say that these societies weren't actually ready for democracy. You have to have a progression in time for these things to take place. Did any of you three have any comments on these paragraphs or anything that I just said there?
The first sentence is hilarious. 2 or 3 decades ago, when Marxism enjoyed its greatest prestige among American intellectuals, I think it holds pretty good prestige nowadays. But just shooting into the wind with that one. I thought that was kind of funny in respects to we're hearing this in 1978. She's like, 30 years ago in the 1940s, and it's just like, well, they stayed and they still have prestige because we're all a bunch of New Deal Democrats. Remember, they're kids. But no, I mean, this is sort of the baseline of how we're going to view, even to this day, right, when the conversation over democracy happens, there are still you can call them globo homo accoutrements, but at the core of it all, like, this is the central platform in which we talk about all these things, which is democracy needs to have open mobility. We need to be pluralistic, and nowadays that pluralism includes like all sorts of sodomy and whatever. And then the right kind of political culture that encourages that. And by right kind of political culture, we mean a very Western Anglo definition of democracy here. She's cribbing from John Stuart Mill, but with the particular subversive elements that come with it. So what we're seeing here is that we want to provide mobility and encourage achievement. Like, you're seeing, like, when we talk about, for instance, to use maybe a more contemporary example, when you look at, say, the Source engine, right? Like, even Source 2.0, at the core root of Source, you go back even earlier, there's Source 1.0. You go back even earlier, there's Gold Source. You go back even earlier, you get a modified version of the Quake engine. And so you have, like, this is, I guess, what you would call like the Quake engine style elements that are going to be built off of the kind of interventionism political formula that we still hear from people like President Biden today, right? Is this that we're making, the world has to be safe for democracy. Democracy means this. When we don't have our aid going to Israel or to South Korea or to Ukraine, we're not fulfilling our goals as being sort of this proselytizer, this evangelist for democracy. You can't have an open, plural society with achievement for everybody, including infinity Africans coming into your country. We have to ensure that democracy lives. And even down there at the beginning, there's that John Stuart Mill, J.S. Mill kind of idea. And if de Maistre thought that Rousseau was the greatest fool, I think the Anglos have their version right here.
Yeah, and that's pretty universal across most people that have had to deal with John Stuart Mill. I think the only people that still like him today are like these mainstream economists, and even then they're kind of dying out as well in favor of a more socialistic line of thought, far more than John Stuart Mill would allow. So there was another thing that I wanted to point out somewhere down here.
Well, while you're looking, I'm just going to say that it's interesting too, even that John Stuart Mill quote, and you can kind of see that Kirkpatrick gets it a little bit, but there's definitely a loss of the sort of tinge of foreign policy of peoples being fundamentally different, not just because of like situations that are imposed on them, but that peoples themselves can be different that a guy like Lothrop Stoddard put in the minds of of foreign policymakers for a while, but by this time is totally gone and is totally unacceptable to believe. I think that's also sort of an interesting tension in even the whole like democracy building stuff, is this sort of, oh, well, we just need to get the conditions right? Like the problem with these liberals is they don't understand that you need better conditions to make everyone into a John Stuart Mill pluralistic democracy type, when that's just perhaps totally not the case.
Right, and this is the reason why I was trying to search for this quote down here, because and this is the paragraph, just to prove what Mr. Brooks just said. Kirkpatrick continues down this line of thought, thinking that everyone can progress towards democracy. She writes, "In the relatively few places where they exist, democratic governments have come into being slowly, after extended prior experience with more limited forms of participation, during which leaders have reluctantly grown accustomed to tolerating dissent and opposition. Opponents have accepted the notion that they may defeat but not destroy incumbents, and people have become aware of government's effects on their lives and of their own possible effects on government. Decades, if not centuries, are normally required for people to acquire the necessary disciplines and habits. In Britain, the road from the Magna Carta to the Act of Settlement to the Great Reform Bills of 1832, 1867, and 1885 took 7 centuries to traverse. American history gives no better grounds for believing that democracy comes easily, quickly, or for the asking. A war of independence, an unsuccessful constitution, a civil war, a long process of gradual enfranchisement marked our progress towards constitutional government, democratic government. The French path was still more difficult. Terror, dictatorship, monarchy, instability, and incompetence followed on the revolution that was to usher in a millennium of brotherhood. Only in the 20th century did the democratic principle finally gain wide acceptance in France, and not until after World War II were the principles of order and democracy, popular sovereignty, and authority finally reconciled an institution strong enough to contain conflicting currents of public opinion. So, I think this is perhaps the most telling paragraph out of this whole essay when she's describing the long march towards democracy, this Whig view of progressive history, where somehow Britain is better in the 1970s or 80s for its democracy, more noble, more desirable, if not just because it aligns with American interests, allegedly. I don't know that a good section of Britain's Labour Party at this point in time was too terribly pro-American. But regardless, she is viewing this as a good thing. These reform bills, the acts of settlement, and whatever else. She is viewing these things here in the American context as painful, sometimes bad things that just brought us to this ideal in the current day, where we have this great functioning liberal democracy. The French path, she says, was full of these absolutely evil and terrifying things. The Great Reign of Terror, the various dictatorships, the monarchies, which is probably to her more evil than this over here.
I have to find it interesting that she's using, like, there's a weird sort of, I don't even know if she noticed it when she wrote it. Maybe she did, but the French aspect, she's criticizing terror, dictatorship, monarchy, instability, and incompetence that was ushered to a millennium of brotherhood. So she's offering that this sort of violent, progressive form of revolution is this sort of like Chiliastic millenarianism, like these utopian progressives, these anti-monarchist, anarchist, socialist types, all of these sort of Robespierre style people, these Jacobins. So look at what terrible things that they've done. And then you just like look up through the rest of this entire paragraph and right afterwards that no, the terror, instability, and incompetence of the 20th century also leads to our own kind of millenarian conceptualization of democracy. Like she's like, oh, no. We're not that kind of millenarianism. We're another kind of millenarianism. And here we are, right? We're all going to make it with democracy.
Right, and that's implicit by the fact that she holds up all of these progressions here, not in like a sort of paleocon way where they find differences between the American and French revolutions, saying one is good when the other is bad for obvious reasons. No, all of these things are a good progression to Kirkpatrick because they have all ended in the great endpoint of liberal democracy.
Yeah, this is the, like, everything I don't like is utopian. argument. I mean, we've heard this before. I can't think where.
Do you mind elaborating there, John? Sort of connecting it.
Oh no,
And
like
elaborating the point.
this reminds me very much of like a Jordan Cooper's like 5 principles of being a conservative. Is that we're not to be a conservative is to be against utopianism, by which you mean you want like a gradual reform process.
Right.
I don't know. Like it's a hell of an admission to say, yeah, like democracy only took root in France and its institutions after World War II. I mean, that's a pretty big admission there.
And she quite conveniently leaves out that this democracy in France that she likes so terribly much only came after a communist government was elected and couped. So
yeah,
even by the time this is being said, or this is being written by Kirkpatrick, this last part of the paragraph I think is very weak, given the current events that were happening.
Well, and even like how democratic are you really going to say the reign of de Gaulle was, right? I mean, there's certainly some there, but even that is a little bit of a stretch.
Right, exactly. Like de Gaulle's whole purpose was to sort of combine a sort of a strongman style, harkening back to older French governments with a democratic counterpart. That's the whole ideology. But however, and according to her view of history, I guess that would be an improvement over the dysfunctional governments of the last republics, the Napoleonic empires 1 and 2. I guess to her, this is just sort of the Whiggish progress that's supposed to accompany all governments as they progress towards democracy. There might be setbacks, sure, I think, according to her view, but they all do progress in this sort of Whiggish pattern towards this great democracy.
It's like a conservative or American form of like Fabianism, I guess.
Right. I think this is very much the distilled Whig view of history. I'm trying to use that in its academic term. This is viewing history as a straight line upwards towards democracy with a few fluctuations here and there along the way. And she is ascribing a very positive view of democracy to this. That's her value analysis there. And just to answer a question from the chat about the specifics of the essay, when she says by institutions strong enough to contain conflicting currents of public opinion, what is meant? She's using this is where the neoconservatism once again shines through. She's not necessarily talking about the UN, though that is an institution that does this. She's talking about this conservative conception of institutions as these things that everyone coalesces around, that fosters a democratic environment, that gets people engaged, that provides public trust to the population. That it's the standard conservative argument about institutions, or at least now it's standard. At this point in time, you may have had a sort of paleo or a traditionalist segment of the population that would just say, well, the reason that these were allowed to progress in the way they did is because they were Americans, British, and French, whereas the reason they aren't progressing as well in Vietnam or wherever else is because they're Vietnamese. These peoples have, as Grant Brooks mentioned earlier, different cultures that prevent different cultures, different peoples, different heritages, whatever you want to say is the cause. They are different from us, and they therefore may not be able to have a functioning democracy if they even wanted one to begin with, even if it was positive. This is this simplifying everything down to institutions is very much a neoconservative tactic to get around the old traditionalist arguments that peoples are different and that will have an impact on domestic and foreign policy. This is mainly why I wanted to bring up this paragraph, is because it just throws out the window this idea that peoples and countries are different. So with that, we're almost to where she starts recommending specifics, where she starts to transition into really correcting foreign policy instead of just outlining its errors. I don't think we need to go over this part necessarily because she's going into specifics. And if anyone wanted any more from the State Department, this is the section. This is the section that we can read. It's going to be very similar to what we read earlier when we were talking about the Shah and Iran. It's just going to be that, but applied to specific countries and their current goings on. But sorry, I should have highlighted this before I went live today.
If you want to feel old, this is a fun way to do that to our lovely Gen X audience.
Okay, this is where she starts to transition into talking about what has to be done. She gets much more specific about ideologies and philosophies. Kirkpatrick writes, the Carter administration's approach to foreign affairs was clearly foreshadowed in this gentleman's book, whose name I am never going to have a chance to pronounce correctly. Brzezinski's.
Brzezinski's.
Yeah, cool.
And you're gonna love this. Guess he's got a daughter, and guess where she works?
Where might she work, Mr. Prudentialist?
She works at MSNBC with Morning Joe. Mika Brzezinski.
It's quite funny.
Wait, the same one? Like that's actually like his daughter?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Makes her meltdowns about Trump even more funny.
Oh, is she one of the people that went viral for a Trump meltdown?
Yeah. She's like Trump derangement syndrome. She's on all those compilations.
Fantastic.
And Brzezinski is one of the most famous foreign policy architects. He kind of builds off of people like Speakman and Mackinder. Like this is the fun thing when we talk about the Cold War. The Cold War is the continuation of the Great Game, right? The whole Anglo Great Game concept between sort of the Anglosphere and Russia. Our foreign policy has functionally not evolved when it comes to dealing with Russia and the Soviet Union in over 100 years. Despite the fact that the technology has changed, the world stage has changed, the geopolitical actors are changing and are different. But boy, oh boy, do we still look at this shit like it's 1899. And it's the funniest thing on God's green earth to know that we are playing like a 19th century game with 21st century toys and with 21st century demographics. It's too good. It's too good. This is the great irony of our current situation.
No, it's like that joke on.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying there's this funny post on X where it was like currently on X you can watch 21st century people like talk to 19th century people about 19th century subjects like, should women vote or are the Russians going to take back Crimea? And it's just true. Like we're in this like ancient paradigm of Russia as the great enemy against the glorious Anglosphere, and that like nothing about that has changed.
Yeah, that post is really funny. I was going to say as well, the difference between the elite and you, the dissident Anon playing EU4, is just that they're doing it in real life.
I think this might be worth taking a step back from the essay just for a second. We can pick back up at this paragraph whenever we get done with this, because I think this point is very very pressing. To Mr. Prudentialist or anyone else on the stream here, what would the alternative be? What should be happening between the United States and Russia, according to you guys at the very least, since we're playing this antiquated great game? Mr. Prudentialist, you mentioned demographic change as well as the driving factor.
I just simply was comparing. We do not have the demographics of like 130 plus IQ Anglos running America anymore, but you can actually go read Between Two Ages. I would highly recommend it. But as to regards to what we should be doing, oh boy, that's a loaded question. I mean, unfortunately, for better or for worse, and depending on if you view this in like the Spenglerian sense, or if you view this in the way that Samuel P. Huntington did, like America and Russia are two fundamentally different civilizations. You had a moment to where you could have taken advantage of the Sino-Soviet split after the Cold War and had something going for them. But again, our foreign policy has been motivated since the end of the Cold War to prevent a, dare I say, a never again situation with respects to having Russia be a geopolitical competitor on the world stage. And this is where you have realists who are, by all means, they're just liberals. They just have they're a little more sober in their analysis, where you get people like Mearsheimer's the most famous one, but you've got other people like Dr. Barry Posen, who would argue that, listen, like we need a more restrained foreign policy towards Eastern Europe, and we need to be focusing on the Asiatics and the Middle East far more. Unfortunately, like we still look at the world this way, and even my analysis understands that right now Russia is a rival. I think you can contain them a lot better through economic means, or you could have. America's in a situation where it's in a position that anything that we want to do with the Russians, so much from the last 40 years is already in play that I don't know if you have time to stop the key from turning, because they're in a pretty decent position now with the academic agent calls it like some sort of like tripartite alliance, but I mean that alliance is very real and you have to deal with that now. And again, the United States is standing in the world stage is very similar to what she's complaining about right now. And I'm glad that you're covering the neoconservatives, Ryan, because I'm sort of like trying to like act almost as if I'm Cassandra, where I'm making the same call. Like everything that we've seen from Bill Ackman to our position on Israel to how we're dealing with Russia, the neoconservatives have reared their ugly head back into relevance. And it's in part, it always rears its head back into relevance because when left with the choice of a current progressive foreign policy or maybe a more realistic alternative, neoconservatism usually steps up to be either the third way or the containment to other positions on foreign policy doctrine.
Right, and this might be worth mentioning just in broader context of this essay. This is not actually like the full realist position, even though it's presenting itself to be that. You had other people, neoconservative or not, trying to articulate an even more realistic approach to foreign policy. If I remember correctly, I think this essay inspired like counter essays from minor and basically unknown today figures that basically viewed this as too idealistic. They that argued for like a purely pragmatic geopolitical stance by the United States that didn't have anything to do with developing democracies, but just had to do with ensuring that our interests were satisfied.
Well, I mean, this is what because she quotes Brzezinski like right here, and this is really the big this is in I think the introductory section of Between Two Ages. I haven't read this book since college. Neither have I read this essay since college, and that's been a few years now. But yeah, Brzezinski has this sort of rational humanism approach, in that we need to have global perspectives, a humanitarian approach, rather than just like trademark political confrontations. But I mean, these are just new political formulas to address the issue of great power politics, because you can't evade it, because the natural course for the nation state traditionally was just hegemony. Although in the 21st century, the question of does the nation state even have sovereignty anymore is a huge question. I mean, in the United States, I think it would be functionally impossible without acknowledging civilian mass casualties and military service members being killed like a cartel execution video on LiveLeak if we were to go to war with Mexico over the cartel issue. In the same way that a lot of the violence that we see in a lot of these urban centers isn't just black on black violence, but it's like cartels versus the Chinese versus like native blacks that are already in the city with their gangs. And so, you know, yeah, we can talk about like evolving or preoccupation with national supremacy. We don't even have national supremacy. We don't even have national sovereignty here at home. And again, there are some things that America just took for granted, and one of them was its demographic makeup.
Yeah, thank you for elaborating that point there. I was wondering how spicy you're going to take that, but it was a very clear and a cool analysis, if you will, kind of harrowing if you think about the implications. I did want to mention another thing as well. Let me think about how to put this. This neoconservative foreign policy that we're going over, very much. Why does it sound dissonant? It's because it's trying to put on a realist veneer, and in to fairness, some of the people that might have seen that as a sideswipe. I don't know how realistic any of this actually is. I don't know if she is actually trying to be realistic or using the realism as sort of a cover for the ideology that we've been sifting throughout this. That might be something for the audience itself to determine. But I did want to get this panel's opinion as well before moving on, since we sort of stepped away for a short tangent. Mr. Prudentialist and Mr. Brooks, I don't think either of you would call yourselves isolationists, and I'm sure both of you probably see that as an ahistorical American position. If I describe that correctly, could you guys give like a sort of a reason as to why? Because this the audience on my channel and to anything else that I write can probably come away with my position to it, and probably will in the future. But if either of you two could give a reason as to how you can be sort of actually on the right, and not necessarily a full-blown isolationist. Could either of you guys explain what the position there might be, so that we don't have to just contrast perhaps my non-interventionism with Kirkpatrick's realism? I don't want to pigeonhole any of our guys into a neoconservative
I
hole.
don't think you can call Kirkpatrick a realist.
Okay, yeah, elaborate, please.
Well, I mean, Kirkpatrick, well, to some extent, maybe you could, but I mean, the key difference between sort of allegedly a key difference between neoconservatism and realism is going to be your understanding of how nation states operate. Now, the big critic of, say, like neo-realist understanding of things like that sort of emerges from like Kenneth Waltz and Mearsheimer is this school of thought called constructivism. I'm sorry, Ryan, I'm going to go on this sort of like weird academic tangent.
No, that's the reason you're on here.
Okay. Oh, well, that's sorry, kids. You're gonna have to listen for a minute. And anyway, so to get the point across, one of the things that realists try and argue is that there are more grounded material in rationalist understanding for why nation states go to war. So, for instance, this is why Mearsheimer seems like such a pariah on the world stage when he says, well, hey, maybe America did some things that would have like provoked Russia to act the way that it has. And of course, there are some motivating aspects of Russia, which the realists kind of sweep under the rug. But what emerged was the school of thought in the mid 1990s called constructivism, because they were particularly upset by the fact that a lot of realists and even liberals and neoconservatives could not answer the question, why didn't any of those three schools of thought predict the fall of the Soviet Union? And so the constructivists, as the name implies, look towards things like social construction, ideology, and political formula as to what motivates states and people to act on it. There's a famous essay called "The State is What You Make of It," or "Anarchy is What You Make of It," if I remember correctly, because the traditional claim by realists, and by most people I think that take it for granted, but realists most especially, is that the world is an innately anarchic state. There is no global sovereign. There is no earthly king of this world, although the Prince of Darkness certainly rules over it. You have to then rely on nation states that are pursuing power hegemony in order to enforce the international standards that we know. So the law, of course, on the international stage is enforced by hard power and the economic means to do so. The constructivists were arguing that you have to consider the political, psychological, and social constructions for why a nation pursues policy that it does. And this, I think, relates actually really nicely to our to anyone's basic understanding of elite theory, right? So what does Mosca tell you? Mosca tells you that people are ruled by political formulas. They're given the motivation on these formulas to act in a certain way that justifies their own power or justifies their own existence. And so what is Kirkpatrick outlining other than the political formula that, like, the Whig history, end of history type understanding of democracy, that it is an emancipatory process that takes a long time throughout the decades, if not centuries, to bring people out to do so. Now, in the 19th and the 20th centuries and the rise of communism, you're now seeing a response to this, which you can actually see in the paragraph above, where the Carter administration is guided by a relatively full-blown philosophy of history, which includes, as philosophies of histories always do, a theory of social change, a doctrine of modernization. Like other philosophies of history that have appeared in the West since the 18th century, the Carter administration's doctrine predicts progress in the form of modernization for all societies and a happy ending, which is sort of funny because neoconservatism takes hold of this sort of stuff as well. And this is where she will go off and sort of bring these about and quote a lot of Brzezinski. But in this case, what we're seeing is that neoconservatism does have some key factors. And you've outlined this with your reading in your last Turnips Digest stream, which was really good. I'm glad that you covered those essays. But additionally, the neoconservative model is trying to adhere to sort of the fusionist understanding of new conservatism, sort of this new emerging conservative model that's sort of based off Barry Goldwater. You have an interest in the Middle East, but you're focused explicitly on anti-communism. The communism is the stumbling block that we have dashed our foot against in this sort of pursuit of democratic modernization. Now, because we're not being strong enough to remove that stumbling block in the same way that we weren't strong enough to remove, Napoleon, it took some years. In the same way we didn't remove Hitler, it took some years. That's the key factor here. The difference, I think, heavily between realism and neoconservatism is that neoconservatism does have a more politically motivated modus operandi, whereas realism, depending on who you talk to, I mean, remember, guys, Mearsheimer's a big lib. He's sort of a libtard. He was supportive of Bernie Sanders in 2016, saying that the biggest threat to American national security was income inequality. But even he, right, recognizes that you have to look at the other side and where power collides. Whereas this, you're getting a much more politicized philosophy of history in comparison to the realist understanding or even the constructivist understanding that we have to acknowledge that power, iron sharpens iron, and that other nation states must pursue a defense of sovereignty above all else if they wish to exist. And so, long story short, I wouldn't call neoconservatism realist in any sense. I would argue, however, it is certainly far more realist than what you've currently got on the world stage right now. Although you could argue that that is certainly a form of neoconservatism, but it's also what the realists would call liberal hegemony, which to some extent is the conclusive, in logical conclusion of neocon foreign policy.
Fantastic. I'm very happy that you contrasted this with realism. John, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I actually agree with Bernie. I mean, in a sense, like income inequality is the greatest threat to America's national sovereignty because you basically need this like competent class of people to not only just staff everything, but also be your fighting force. And not just in terms of like net income per year, but in terms of what institutions they'll be inheriting, what cultural capital remains in terms of, what we could think of as an income of more than just money. Yes, I mean, the inequality of that is a massive threat to America's sovereignty. It is why in 30 years, you're not going to be able to go marching around the world on these like nation state building adventures. Now, you can't fix that with like welfare payments. Like that's not something you can fix, but it is in a sense true. Like the Bernie bros are kind of tapping into something that is fundamentally true. They just have to look at it in these like very like almost like old leftist frame where it's all about like money, but it is not incorrect like conceptually.
Yeah, I have a feeling, kind of as you were alluding to there, that perhaps Bernie and his supporters did not think of this in anything other than material terms. But
I mean, yeah, but neither do like conservative, like post-liberal types. But yeah, yes. I mean, that is fundamentally, they are correct in that there is an inequality of income. And go ahead.
I was just going to say this might be a good thing to bring up if ever we discuss the ongoing question of should white American men join the military. But that is a discussion for another time. Before we get too sidetracked, and I promise we will return to the essay very quickly, Mr. Brooks, I was hoping that you, with your knowledge of the progressive era, hopefully something with their foreign policy, I was wanting to know if you could contrast what the neoconservative is writing here with perhaps what the progressives advocated. Or perhaps the Carter administration with the progressives, if you're able to do so.
Well, obviously the progressives aren't a monolith. There's competing schools, but the progressives of the age where Wilson brings America into being a global power explicitly instead of just implicitly. And this kind of ties in with your question, Ryan. America's understanding of the world is significantly more racialized, both implicitly and explicitly. There is, from the progressives, a view that, intervention or interfering in other places is necessary because the world that we're stepping into is so interconnected that American sovereignty depends on a certain degree of our ability to influence world events. And this is the argument that kind of, there's still germs of it even in the United Nations. I contrasted before in essays that I've written, the view of the United Nations versus the League of Nations from sort of what you might call the right-wing progressives and somewhat the old right, like Taft and Henry Cabot Lodge. Like, the debates in Congress about the League of Nations fails in the American Congress because they say explicitly this would abrogate American sovereignty, and American sovereignty is worth more to us than joining the League. And by this point, Wilson is kind of broken and, for a variety of reasons, isn't really able to accomplish the things that he intended to accomplish. And even the Treaty of Versailles demonstrates that, because Wilson's whole view of that was that was a mistake. But when the UN is created, it's sold as this is a way of preserving American sovereignty. So when the progressives and when Americans generally embarked on this idea of like, okay, we're not just going to be a sphere sovereign state, right, where we're interfering in local affairs, but generally speaking, we're trying to keep out of the affairs of Europe, the affairs of far-flung places. When that changes, it changes because there is this belief that we have to do this in order to defend American sovereignty, in order to defend our ability to be what we are. So I think in terms of like why I would say I'm not an isolationist, or why I find that view is somewhat alien to American foreign policy in some ways, it's because I generally agree with that. I generally agree with the idea that world affairs can heavily influence your country, and you need to be able to muscle on world affairs to a certain degree. And I mean, the obvious example in a very early context, right, is the Barbary pirates that Thomas Jefferson goes to war with. And even the American Navy is really created to go to war with. So in this sense, the progressives, though, the thing that you have to understand, and it's going to go back to the very first thing I said, is that the progressives of Wilson's era, or of the 1920s and 30s, are totally different from the progressives of the post-war consensus and obviously of the neocons era. The progressives before World War II are these people who are, for the most part, Americans, WASPs, who are raised with these much more, shall we say, right-wing views of history, who would be much more in touch with Spengler and others in terms of direct reading even, than these progressives who come later, who really, when they say progressive, what they mean is that, they kind of pull the progressive hat over the communism or socialism or other sort of egalitarian ideals that they smuggle under that label of progressive. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it answers it perfectly. And once again, I'd like to remind the audience that if you want to explore either of what Mr. Prudentialist has just said or what Grant Brooks has just said, you can find their links in the description. I would be positively shocked if either of them have not discussed their own views on these things on their own platforms.
Grant, have you read Bill Williams?
Yeah, I have.
Okay, because I was like, take the Bill Williams pill. Take the Bill Williams pill. It's so good. He has a whole chapter called The Myth of Isolation, Ryan. And if you haven't read those books, you really do need to. Empire is a Way of Life, or The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, because they come off as very old school progressive, and maybe to build off of Sandy's K-line thesis that maybe just the old school progs are a big part of the corpus of thought for whatever constitutes the DR these days, which I think is true, because if you read Bill Williams, you're like, yep, a lot of this makes sense.
Well, that was the Nemitz tweet, right? Like 2 years ago, where he says the dissident right is just a very mangled version of the original progressive movement.
Oh boy, racist liberalism strikes again.
I haven't actually read that book, but I have actually written on the subject of isolationism specifically being ahistorical, which might come as a surprise, but I have actually written on this specifically, and it's basically just me going through the facts of where were we intervening and for how long. You can't make an argument that we were really isolationist ever. That doesn't change the value analysis of is it good or not, but it is certainly ahistorical. I think would be a very clear inference.
Well, and I think too, even the whole point of isolationist as a label, it's one that's used oppositionally. It's not
right, exactly.
That was sort of adopted by a faction. It was more like this highly interventionist, specifically interventionist faction saying, my enemies are isolationists.
Right, and this is that was the second thing that I wrote about on this topic, and I actually don't think I've shared that on a stream before. But this is the that's the link in chat if anyone's actually interested in that. But regardless, I don't want to hold everyone here. I don't want to hold everyone here longer than we have to be, just because it is still a bit early in the morning. I promised we would get back to this paragraph here, just because it kind of shows a central contention between neoconservatives and the old establishment liberals. So, Brzezinski's 1970 book on the U.S. role in the technotronic era between two ages. In that book, Brzezinski showed that he had the imagination to look beyond the Cold War to a brave new world of global politics and interdependence. To deal with that new world, a new approach was said to be evolving, which Brzezinski designated rational humanism. In the new approach, the preoccupation with national supremacy would give way to global perspectives, and international problems would be viewed as human issues rather than as political confrontations. The traditional intellectual framework for dealing with foreign policy would have to be scrapped, and she quotes from the book, "Today the old framework of international politics, with their spheres of influence, military alliances between nation-states, the fiction of sovereignty, doctrinal conflicts arising from 19th century crisis, is clearly no longer compatible with reality." And she's going to keep citing this book and kind of steel-manning it, perhaps straw-manning it. I haven't read it yet, but it's certainly given in a very sarcastic tone, so I'm not going to make that judgment. But she's going to
This isn't going to be read in a sarcastic tone, by the way.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, she's going to take this as sort of gospel truth, which makes sense considering Brzezinski's role in sort of like foreign policy construction of the National Security Agency. Like, this book was well regarded when it was published. And the argument about like the technotronic age is that America's like innovation has been like the leading drive for a lot of the social changes in our like foreign policy and doctrine, but also on the world stage as well. But like so many people of his time, Brzezinski also predicted that the Soviet Union was going to stick around a lot longer than anyone thought.
Right, and just so that we can tie this back into the central theme of the essay, and once again, I'd like to remind the audience you can read the whole thing for yourself, since this isn't a comprehensive covering of it. She says, "The central concern of Brzezinski's book, as of the Carter administration's foreign policy, is with the modernization of the Third World. From the beginning, the administration has manifested a special intense interest in the problems of the so-called Third World. But instead of viewing international developments in terms of the American national interest, as national interest is historically conceived, the architects of administration policy have viewed them in terms of a contemporary version of the same idea of progress that has traumatized Western imaginations since the Enlightenment." This is another place where the neoconservatism shines through. They claim to be very heavily anti-Enlightenment. This is what Crystal was invoking a lot in the last week's essay, where he tries to show how very modern these people are and how traditional he is by going back to these older conceptions of virtue and loveliness and whatever else. It's just they may in fact be anti-Enlightenment. I'm not sure that I would concede them that, but they're certainly extremely modern. So this is another neoconservative tactic to paint themselves as traditionalists or as the real old faction, the real right wing, and then try to subvert anyone that is actually carrying over any traditional opinions. I don't want to throw too terribly large stones here, but I feel like this is what a lot of the DeSantis crowd is doing, especially as he has courted old neoconservative influences. A lot of his defenders, especially in person or online or at these conferences or whatever, will paint themselves as the real right. How could you support a non-right-winger in the form of Trump, who is not moral, he is buffoonish or whatever else? DeSantis is the real right. This is the sort of same neoconservative tactics that you can see even today.
I'm sorry, who's this DeSantis guy you keep talking about? Like,
Yeah,
is
who
this
is
some
he?
like new political writer I've not heard of?
I mean, I wish that's all he.
I think he's an
All he
autistic
meant to
man
do.
from
Leader of
Florida.
a small Latin American republic that I live in.
Oh, okay. So he's
Okay.
like Juan Guaido, kind of like that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Oh, speaking of racialism in foreign policy, even though Brzezinski is a complete foreigner, that racialism is all over this book, by the way. He's basically saying, like, the third world intelligentsia is so focused on like ideas and these abstractions from like the 19th century for ideal of revolution and Marxism, that basically he's saying like these swarthoids can't understand that like the technology will outpace their ideas.
I mean, that's that's a fantastic point that kind of flew past me.
So much of geopolitics, honestly, is like literally just going over the most racist ideas possible from the 19th century, but saying them as politely as possible so no one connects the dots.
It's so true, though. It's so true. Like if you're an HBD fan, I'm sorry, geopolitics is right up your alley.
I have noticed that. I used to be very bored by geopolitics until I started reading between the lines, if you will. And then just to pull in another thinker here that she's going to draw on as we're nearing the thrust of her ideas. The crucial elements of the modernization concept have been clearly explicated by Samuel P. Huntington, who, despite a period of the National Security Council, was assuredly not the architect of the administration's policy. The modernization paradigm, Huntington has observed, postulates an ongoing process of change, complex because it involves all dimensions of human life and society, systemic because its elements interact in predictable, necessary ways, global because all societies will necessarily pass through the transition from traditional to modern, lengthy because time is required to modernize economic and social organizations, character and culture, phased because each modernizing society must pass through essentially the same stages, homogenizing because it tends towards the convergence and interdependence of societies, irreversible because the direction of change is given and the relation of the elements of the process, progressive in the sense that it is desirable and in the long run provides significant benefits to the affiliated peoples. So, Mr. Prudentialist, perhaps my reading comprehension is just suffering from the cold air of this room that I'm in right now, but this sounds a lot like third world modernization is just globo homo. Is that wrong?
Yeah, that's how I read it.
Okay, fantastic. Like I'm surprised at kind of how
he kind of makes the point. Although he argues later in his life, when he writes the Clash of Civilizations, he's just basically saying that the modernization of the third world is going to lead. It's not going to bring you this like global village. Everyone's gonna sing kumbaya. Like if anything, he doesn't cite McLuhan, but he kind of crips from him, where he's like, listen. The closer we get together in this more interconnected world, the more our differences are going to shine through, and we're going to have clashes again. And he gave an interesting prediction. I need to revisit that book. I covered it like when I was first started on this as the Prudentialist on the internet. But yeah, his basic argument was that like sure, you can sort of have homogenization and convergence, but this also means that the irreversible damage that's done with that will be like the return of civilizational clash on sort of these broader regional ideas. So like the Western European world will be pitted against Russia as it has been previously, despite its interconnectivity. The Arab world, i.e. the Muslim world, is going to have its own problems as the Sunnis and Shias clash. But when it comes to the rest of the world, the petty infighting still matters, but it only matters to the degree of how are we messing with the outsider world of the kafir. And again, this is like this came out like 1996, so like maybe a few years shortly before he had died. But it hasn't aged particularly well, ironically, because like he just mentioned civilization, despite him writing the book Who Are We? He gets criticized by Francis Fukuyama, his student of all people, that he doesn't talk about race or ethnicity very much, but. Yeah, a big chunk of this is that like progress leads to homogenization, which leads to globo homo as we know it, and this is going to have some very big problems in the latter half of the 20th century and 21st. But it's a fun thing to consider, and you should read it on your own. I highly recommend that you read his work.
Yeah, and at least in the way that this is portrayed, Kirkpatrick at least seems to view this as desirable, and this is because she's going to basically continue using it. She's going to call it optimistic, which I think is both I think she means that in the full weight of the word, where she wishes that it was so simple, but also it's too naive to be fully true. And that's specifically going to be in this paragraph down here. where she says, this perspective on contemporary events is optimistic in the sense that it foresees continuing human progress, deterministic in the sense that it perceives events as fixed by processes over which persons and policies can have but little influence, moralistic in the sense that it perceives history and U.S. policy as having moral ends, cosmopolitan in the sense that it attempts to view the world not from the perspective of American interests or intentions, but from the perspective of the modernizing nation, with both revolution and morality, and U.S. policy with all three. So she's basically just laid down this idea of proper third world modernization. She's very much building up this theory to be a positive. I think would be a good takeaway from this section, and she's going to be citing various different State Department officials once again to show how this is this much more multifaceted view than perhaps the Carter administration's human rights initiatives and whatever else. This multifaceted, more realist perspective is much more level-headed and allows for social progress, which is once again a key aspect of neoconservative policy. And she's going to go into this idea of forces, which is exactly what anyone in this audience might think a force is in societal or history, societal views or history or whatever else. It's the institutions argument again, where you can just sort of abstract everything into these very neutral ideas, so that you don't have to deal with specifics like people being different. You can just say that there are forces at play here, or there are institutions that need to be developed, or whatever else it might be. She's going to then these a little bit. She'll say, so what if historical forces at such diverse places as Iran, the Horn of Africa, Southeast Asia, Central America, and the United Nations look a lot like Russians or Cubans? Having moved back, the president calls our inordinate fear of communism, identified by him in Cold War, we are told, capable of distinguishing Soviet-Cuban mechanisms, which anyway exist mainly in the minds of couriers and others guilty of oversimplifying evolutionary changes, which seem to be the kind that actually occur. And so this is she's using this bit as a critique now. Where she's basically just saying the administration has done it wrong. This is very clearly a sideswipe at just allowing communism to emerge in these nations. And she'll continue even farther. What can a president faced with such complicated, inexorable, impersonal process do? The answer, offered again by the president and his top officials, is much. Since events are not caused by human decisions, they cannot be stopped or altered by them. Zelensky, for example, has said, we recognize that the world is changing under the influence of forces no government can control. And Cyrus has cautioned, the fact is that we can no more stop than could waters, or can you, I can't pronounce that, but this is she's viewing, as we've seen already, she's sort of a Whiggish progression of human development. And so does the current regime under Carter, at least when she's writing this. Her main contention is that they aren't doing it right. They're using this Whiggish idea as like a fatalistic concession that communism will just have to spread, whereas to Kirkpatrick, this progression can be positive and in U.S. interests. Is that too terribly much of a wrong reading for any of you guys? Is that what you guys took away from this little section? Still with me?
I'm going to be honest, like, neoconservative writing, if you just read it long enough, starts to sound like Platonism or something. We're like talking about like causes and forces and sort of the mystical, underlying, impersonal elements of the universe. It's a bit jarring sometimes.
Yeah, and that's I feel like once again, my contention, as has been made clear this whole stream, is that they're just doing this to escape some of the older and more controversial elements of human development, like, say, that the fact that races could be different, or that ethnicities could be different, that peoples could have different heritages that would prevent them from developing exactly as Britain and the U.S. did.
I mean, in a sense, like, Marxism is better at explaining its theory of history than neoconservatives are. Because at least Marxism has this like very clear dialectical process, and you can kind of like you can explain it in like a 30-minute lecture, whereas like neoconservatives, I think you have to like practice alchemy or something to like try to understand their worldview.
Well, it's a feature, not a bug, like the way that this language works. It's a way of signaling, right? Okay, I'm smart. I know what I'm doing. I'm not one of these like dumb ideologues, but also I'm not going to say something that's going to wind up being, like a human rights violation or something.
Which may be ironic.
Well, she's also criticizing, when she says Cold Warriors, I mean, you have to consider who she's criticizing. She's criticizing the Robert Conquests and the George Kennans of the world, who were very much alive and writing about these people at this time.
So, Mr. Prudentialist, would this be seen as sort of like a gatekeeping of like actual right-wing foreign policy?
I would say just a sideswipe.
Okay.
I wouldn't. It's not gatekeeping, because obviously, like, Conquest is a well-established academic, and George Kennan is one of the most famous American diplomats and statesmen of the 20th century. So I wouldn't say it's as much gatekeeping as it is perhaps a critic of the more realist or conservative critics of both the administration, but also its foreign policy.
Fantastic. And just to get through a little bit more of this essay, she does the exact same thing that I outlined here. She's going to accuse the Carter administration of being deterministic and having an apolitical view of contemporary events that encourages American passivity, which to Kirkpatrick is a very incorrect way to go about foreign policy. And she's going to go into a whole litany of Soviet and Cuban and other communist interventions into these places where we were conceding, basically. And she's going to then go to this paragraph down here where she says, what is the function of foreign policy under these conditions? It is to understand the process of change and then, like Marxists, to align ourselves with history, hoping to contribute a bit of stability along the way. And this administration spokesman assured us is precisely what we are doing. The Carter administration has defined the U.S. national interest in the Third World as identical with the putative end of the modernization process. Vance put this with characteristic candor in a recent statement when he explained that U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Third World is, quote, grounded in the conviction that we best serve our interests there by supporting the efforts of developing nations to advance their economic well-being and preserve their political independence. Our commitment to the promotion of constructive change worldwide, Brzezinski's words, has been vouchsafed in every conceivable context. But there is a problem. The conceivable contexts turn out to be mainly those in which non-communist atrocities are under pressure from revolutionary guerrillas. Since Moscow is the aggressive expansionist power today, it is more often than not insurgents encouraged and armed by the Soviet Union who challenge the status quo. The American commitment to change in the abstract ends up by aligning us tacitly with Soviet clients and irresponsible extremists like the Ayatollah Khomeini or, in the end, Yasser Arafat.
Wait, is she trying to imply that like Khomeini was Soviet aligned?
I think that she's trying to say that Khomeini was a Soviet gain just by the fact that the Shah was deposed and then Iran was permanently aligned basically against the U.S.
I mean, there were pretty substantial communist elements in the revolution that Khomeini suppressed. I mean, it was kind of a new, in a sense, like the U.S. is very lucky that the Ayatollah took power and not the communists, because that revolution could have gone very differently. There was so much turmoil that there could have been an actual Soviet client state in Persia.
Right, and I also feel like she's underplaying the extent of how Iranian propaganda focused against the Soviets, and I feel like this is something that basically every American group has done since the Iranian Revolution, is they will forget that the Lesser Satan was the Soviet Union on the Iranian border. And that was just because it's the Lesser Satan does not mean that it is any less extreme.
Yeah, I mean, there was a serious risk of Soviet invasion. I'm sure that the Iranian revolutionary government was more than aware of that. I don't know. It's kind of it's weird to call him a Soviet client. I don't quite get that.
So I think this is best understood as she's viewing it as a Soviet gain just because we lost out in the revolution. I think that might be a like a sort of zero-sum thinking about this. And just to keep going on, she's going to continue to swipe at the Carter administration, where she says, so far, assisting change has not led the Carter administration to undertake the destabilization of a communist country. The principles of self-determination and non-intervention are thus both selectively applied. We seem to accept the status quo in communist nations in the name of diversity and national autonomy, but not in nations ruled by right-wing dictators or white oligarchies. Concerning China, for example, Brzezinski has observed, quote, we recognize that the PRC and we have different ideologies and economic and political systems. We harbor neither the hope nor the desire that through extensive contacts with China, we can remake that nation into an American image. Indeed, we accept our differences. And then she's going to go into a line from the president and a few other people on these various different countries that she's been focusing on throughout the essay.
Who was she quoting just there real quick? Sorry to go back up.
Right here? Should be the president.
Yeah, this is the president.
Yes.
It's the president noted in February. So no, I'm just reading what you had just read right above. Seem to accept the status quo in communist nations in the name of diversity and national autonomy, but not in nations ruled by right-wing dictators or white oligarchies. Okay, just checking. I wanted to make sure. Yeah, I find that particularly interesting. This is that assisting change, trying to modernize has not led to the destabilization of a communist country. Well, that claim was definitely true because your efforts to modernize China or anyone else has been a disaster. And then the desire, of course, to harbor and create a nation to a national image, that's kind of the ultimate conceit of maybe the last 50 years. This is that maybe we could make nations into our own image, as Rand Paul had famously said in the Senate floor one time. You can't turn Saddam Hussein into Thomas Jefferson. It's just stupid.
Right, and another thing that jumped out to me in this paragraph is sort of the neoconservative focus on specifically diversity. And this is not necessarily in a racial sense, but sort of in a linguistic sense or a cultural sense or something else, something that has to run away from the prospect of dealing with a real racial category of some stripe. For some reason, I don't think that Kirkpatrick here is drawing upon the various different races of the world that might have been in vogue earlier on in the century. I have a feeling she probably means this in terms of the myriad of different linguistic and tribal groups that occupy the various different post-colonial states or whatever else. This very neoconservative focus on diversity, basically in its most watered down and harmless form, not something that dissidents would attack today. And I think this is something you can see as well. It's very easy to see who in the modern day in the dissident sphere might be a de-radicalizing agent, and it has to do with how do they define this word right here and what do they think about it.
Well, I think, too, it's interesting. The thing I'm observing is, she's trying very, very carefully to very lightly oppose sort of anti-colonialism. But anti-colonialism is sort of the heart of exactly what she's talking about here. About, oh, well, isn't that interesting, that we're always going against these right-wing countries or white oligarchies, but the communist countries get let off scot-free. Why is that? Why is that? That's very interesting.
Right, that's exactly what she's doing here. It's just, I think that it's in a very sort of, it's almost coming at it from the left, if you will, even though that this is not explicitly leftist. It is certainly not the usual right-wing critique of anti-colonialism. It's like she's trying to provide a much more acceptable reason to be against colonialism for this point in time than coming from the radicals. Hence why she has to focus it on, well, we aren't doing this for the communists, so this must just be a scheme to weaken us, and not just saying that this is bad because it is inherently wrong. So that's a great point there. And then she's going to go on and quote a ton of people from Carter's administration and Carter himself, which I don't think is very relevant to the ideas that she's laying down here. She's just using that as proof. You can read it for yourself. And she's going to once again ask a similar question. Something very odd is going on here. How does an administration that desires to let people work out their own destinies get involved in determined efforts at reform in South Africa, Zaire, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and elsewhere? how can an administration committed to non-intervention in Cambodia and Vietnam announce that it, quote, will not be deterred from righting wrongs in South Africa? What should be made of an administration that sees the U.S. interest as identical with economic modernization and political independence, and yet heedlessly endangers the political independence of Taiwan, a country whose success in economic modernization and egalitarian distribution of wealth is unequaled in Asia? The contrast is as striking as that between the administration's frenzied speed in recognizing the new dictatorship in Nicaragua and its continuing refusal to recognize the elected government of Zimbabwe-Rhodesia, or its refusal to maintain any presence in Zimbabwe-Rhodesia while staffing a U.S. information office in Cuba. Not only are there ideology and double standards at work here, the ideology neither fits nor explains reality, and the double standard involves the administration in the wholesale contradiction of its own principles. So, as we were alluding to at the start, this is where she really starts to rip into how the administration has handled all these other right-wing places, while just giving a blank check to left-wing countries. This is where we get the classic neoconservative purely opposition to the left, because the left is being too far to the left than the neoconservatives are happy with. We saw this a lot last week with Irving Kristol talking about basically FDR economic reforms and economic analyses being too far to the right for the current new left when he was writing. For Kirkpatrick, this sort of a global soft on communism approach is a bit too far to the left for her. She would much rather prefer a perhaps more realistic approach to democratizing and liberalizing parts of the world if they are capable of it. And you can see the sort of left-wing bent here when she lauds Taiwan for an egalitarian distribution of wealth. And to draw back to last week as well, this is sort of how neoconservatives will conceptualize capitalism. It is an equalizing force to them, whereas to the old right, to the libertarian movement, and to the traditionalist conservatives, capitalism is specifically unequal, and that is a good thing. So you get that sort of divergence there. And I have come across people in the dissident right who will view capitalism, once again, as equalizing. So this really, whichever side you fall onto, really is how do you view these free enterprise systems? How do they award people or not award people? So this, I think, is another telling paragraph where even when she's trying to take this like flourish climactic stance against communism and the soft approach from the Carter administration, pointing out its great hypocrisy, she still falls into these left-wing tropes. We aren't doing the correct egalitarianism globally. We aren't doing the correct democratization globally.
We're not living up to our ideals.
Right, exactly. So this is sort of like this is the start of the climax of the essay, or maybe it even is the climax of the essay. This is certainly I have seen this quoted before. This is where you get the title of the essay, and in this like flashy moment of this piece, she sort of reverts back to these classic neoconservative leftist priors.
Well, if you had no standards, if you didn't have double standards, these leftists wouldn't have standards at all.
Right, exactly. So this is
Also, I love this bit about Taiwan. I love this bit about Taiwan. It needlessly endangers the political independence in Taiwan, a country whose success in economic modernization and egalitarian distribution of wealth is unequaled in Asia. This little thing called like the Taipei Communique of 1972. But I mean, even as far back as then, we're seeing the ideological priors that we must defend these like success stories and quote unquote democratization, right? Another form of revolution. I highly recommend people read Ryszard Legutko's The Demon in Democracy. He's this Polish MEP, or he was. And he was basically asking the question, hey, after the Cold War, how come we didn't like do the needful and redact a bunch of communists? And he makes the point that the nice thing about democracy is that it's really good for communists to become a progressive or a social democrat or a good unionist. And so even here with these sort of Trotskyist priors, these leftist priors, is Kirkpatrick just pointing out that it's important to defend our fellow travelers on the world stage.
Right, and this is that is what she's doing. And in fact, it's just this whole paragraph is extremely left wing. That's just the only way I can put it. Which is an ideological analysis, sure, but what else would we read these neoconservatives for?
Yeah, I mean, like Taiwan is dying out. Their birth rate is like what 0.89 or something. Like it's just not going to exist without like some kind of mass importation of like Filipinos or something. It's just not going. Like that's the threat to these capitalist societies in Asia. Like all China has to do is just wait 2 generations, then waltz in.
Right, and something similar about South Korea as well, which is another sort of
South Korea's birth rate is, I
success
think,
story.
worse, or is it like?
I think it is the worst in the world.
Yeah, it's like that's extinction level.
So, yeah, that's the great neoconservative success stories, and I guess the old liberal establishment success stories are these East Asian democracies, liberal capitalist democracies, and they aren't sustainable, apparently.
I mean, even like North Korea manages to sustain a birth rate of like 1.8, like something like that. This is pretty terrible.
So, a good portion of the DR would say that's because of the free enterprise system or something like that. I have a feeling it's probably just because of probably more to do with the democratizing effect on society and
with
government.
Like feminist cults that run these societies.
Right.
That's the problem.
So that's just where I'm going to offer my 2 cents there. And she continues this. This is once again the climax of the essay. I think it's just a flop, really. I was expecting much more when I read this the first time. She says, inconsistencies are a familiar part of politics in most societies. Usually, however, governments behave hypocritically when their principles conflict with the national interest. What makes the inconsistencies of the Carter administration noteworthy are, first, the administration's moralism, which renders it especially vulnerable to charges of hypocrisy, and second, the administration's predilection for policies that violate the strategic and economic interests of the United States. The administration's conception of national interest borders on doublethink. It finds friendly powers to be guilty representatives of the status quo, and views the triumph of unfriendly groups as beneficial to America's true interests. So, this is the classic neoconservative. Our enemies are hypocrites. They aren't living up to their ideals. We need to live up to the ideals harder than they are. And they're also 1984. We get this all in one paragraph. I think it's brilliant. It's definitely come into fruition, this line of reasoning and rhetoric in at least the last 20 years. And then just skipping ahead a little bit. We're going to get down to this part down here unless anyone wanted to cover anything beforehand. Just because this paragraph is noteworthy as well. Kirkpatrick says, because socialism of the Soviet, Chinese, Cuban variety is an ideology rooted in a version of the same values that sparked the Enlightenment and the democratic revolutions of the 18th century, because it is modern and not traditional, because it postulates goals that appeal to Christian as well as to secular values, brotherhood of man, elimination of power as a mode of human relations, it is highly congenial to many Americans at the symbolic level. Marxist revolutionaries speak the language of a hopeful future, while traditional autocrats speak the language of an unattractive past. Because left-wing revolutionaries invoke the symbols and values of democracy, emphasizing egalitarianism rather than hierarchy and privilege, liberty rather than order, activity rather than passivity, they are again and again accepted as partisans in the cause of freedom and democracy. Nowhere is this affinity of liberalism, Christianity, and Marxist socialism more apparent than among the liberals who are duped time and time again into supporting liberators who turn out to be totalitarians, and among left-leaning clerics whose attraction to a secular style of redemptive community is stronger than their outrage at the hostility of socialist and regimes to religion. This is the thrust of like the neoconservative thought. I think this is neoconservative foreign policy distilled to a T right here. You have this sort of you have a claim to be traditional here at the beginning. You have the anti-communism. You have this sort of sideswipe at secular left-wing politics, even though we're going hard for the secular right-wing politics. And then what we have at the end here is this idea that, well, the left-wing revolutionaries are speaking about great things, egalitarianism, liberty, activity, hedonism, and whatever else, but they aren't actually doing it right. And that this is going to then attract left-wing Christians, liberals, and whatever else. You're being duped. These liberals are being duped. They have not yet understood it, and when they do, they will finally go over to our side. I think this is the thrust of conservative diplomatic thought here.
Hello, fellow liberals.
Right, exactly. So, I think that this is really the true culmination of this essay, unlike the desired climax up here. And then she's going to go on and sort of try to close out this essay by highlighting like specifics. She's going to once again harp on other countries and other specific ambassadors from Carter and statements on Nicaragua and Iran and whatever else. And she's just going to keep going on that at this end, trying to tone it down a little. And she's going to say, surely it is now beyond reasonable doubt the present governments of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos are much more repressive than those of the despised previous rulers. That the governments of the People's Republic of China is more repressive than that of Taiwan. That North Korea is more repressive than South Korea, and so forth. This is the important lesson of Vietnam and Cambodia. It is not new, but it is a gruesome reminder of harsh facts. From time to time, a truly bestial ruler can come to power in either type of autocracy. Idi Amin, Papa Doc Duvalier, Joseph Stalin, Pol Pot are examples. But neither type regularly produces such moral monsters, though democracy regularly prevents their accession to power.
Really? Okay.
There are, however, systemic differences between traditional and revolutionary autocracies that have a predictable effect on their degree of repressiveness. Generally speaking, traditional autocrats tolerate social inequalities, brutality, and poverty, while revolutionary autocracies create them. So, this is the real thrust of Kirkpatrick's enemies on the foreign policy scale. Revolutionary autocracies, very bad. They tend to be left-wing. They tend to do bad things, and promoting them would be to do bad. Traditional autocracies are already there, and they're typically U.S. aligned. They only permit it, which is better than creating it. And then she has this third category of totalitarianism, which is Nazi communism, the classic neoconservative enemy. And she's going to go on at the end of this essay. You can read it for yourself. I think we've gone past the useful parts here, where she's going to basically just say we need to support these traditional autocrats, prevent revolutionary autocracies from taking hold if possible, and absolutely oppose totalitarianism on the global stage with all of these left-wing priors that we have already highlighted throughout this essay. So that's all that I really wanted to cover here. I think we got the main ideas out. And hopefully we've differentiated the sort of liberal internationalists that the neoconservatives are often conflated with actual neoconservatism, which I find to be much more perniciously or subtly left-wing than liberal internationalism. Did anyone else have anything from this essay that they wanted to cover before we close out of the screen here?
I would just encourage people to read the texts that Kirkpatrick reads. I mean, I think it would be fun, and maybe I'll do it on my channel now that I'm inspired. But the Between Two Ages is definitely worth reading just to understand that this is what the school of thought was, just for Brzezinski, but also the Carter administration. And then also read what Huntington is put out here. But this whole essay is worth reading to understand that, you know, there's a hair splitting difference between sort of the neocons, their Trotskyite leftist roots, which they still have those priors, and like the communists that they're allegedly fighting. And you can kind of see that despite their ideological differences and the great power differences, still at this root is that we would like this millenarian utopia. We just don't want to achieve it through godless communism. We can do it through other means. We just have to fight communism and let our ideas win out, both by power, money, and politics.
Yeah, I think the very key lesson here that people should take away is that the neoconservatives fundamentally do not view communism as a problem or a threat for the reason that you do, or the reason that I do. They view it this way because they believe it is insufficiently loyal to the principles that they share with the communists.
Right, they're the ones that are bringing about egalitarianism in the most effective and the best way, the most peaceful way. They're the ones bringing about liberalism and true democracy, unlike this communist false democracy, this communist false social liberalism. It's a very real theme, and not just here for Kirkpatrick. And in fact, I have a feeling that if I were to go through each essay in this neoconservative reader, except for perhaps I don't know if Novak does this, because I don't know that he was actually a Trotskyite in his youth, but I'm sure someone could correct me that's more knowledgeable on Roman Catholic political developments surrounding Vatican II. I have a feeling a lot of these people probably are going to say that they oppose communism because it doesn't do the egalitarianism and the left-wing stuff correctly or effectively. Which, if one recalls the old conservative, in quotes, neoconservative adage that communism is good in theory but impossible in practice, that phrase is this sentiment distilled to a T when talking about economic systems. They want the great things of equality, absolute equality. They don't want these class distinctions that are so terrible. They want to make sure that everyone's materially prosperous. They want to get rid of these evil, backwards religions, but they just don't do it correctly, and it's impossible to do it correctly. You can apply that line of thinking to any subject that the neoconservatives cover, be it economics, foreign policy, or whatever else, and it's going to be the neoconservative position that's already been written about 50, 60 years ago.
From Okie socialist college party girl to ambassador to the United Nations for the United States. Press S to spit.
yeah, and this is important as well. I was considering having a thumbnail of Carter and Reagan instead of the current one on Kirkpatrick, just because Reagan loved this. Apparently, this was good enough for Reagan's administration that they all accepted this to where they appointed Kirkpatrick as an ambassador to the UN. She advised them on quite a lot of foreign policy matters. If you want to know the neoconservative administration, it is the Reagan administration. George Bush looks a lot more like a liberal internationalist than he does a neoconservative, and that's just because you can see with his attempts at nation building and whatever else, the invasions, the democratization, and whatnot. It was much more direct, so he wasn't repeating the Carter administration's mistakes. He was doing the exact opposite. But he seems not to have been too terribly inspired by this essay or the other neoconservatives on foreign policy. He neglected a good 80-90% of that essay that we just read. I think that the Bush family fits much more the archetype of a liberal, a left-wing rather, New England establishment group, as opposed to the Reagan administration, which is much more neoconservative on all counts. Economically, very neoconservative. They're not libertarian. They're not traditionalist or anything. They will run major deficits. They will print a ton of money. They will throw a bunch of money at the military development projects. They'll have a conservative welfare state while speaking against it. Perfect neoconservative economics. And then in terms of foreign policy, they will follow this essay that we just went through in part, and that you can go through in full if should you want to. This is going to be their foundation for their philosophy. So, don't discount the Reagan administration for the damage that it has done to the right. Anyone have any last minute thoughts before we get to super chats and chilling? Alrighty, so we had two very generous donations today. Portler for $20. Thank you very much. Says keep up the good work, and by all means, I plan to. Next week, I know at least for sure I'm going to be joined by Raging Mandrill to discuss Irving Kristol's conservative welfare state essay. I have a feeling that'll be fun, and of course, anyone here on the panel has an open invite to any of my streams in general, and certainly these neoconservative ones. Yeah, we're keeping up this neoconservative diatribe. And then a very generous $20 from Belial Bradley in the form of a super sticker. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate it. And I would just like to remind you all that it is because of the generous donations of these individuals here that I can actually organize all of this and spend a morning going over these political developments of things long past. So thank you very much, Portler and Bradley. So with all of that done, where can we find you? Let's start with the Prudentialist. I believe you'll find my friends in the description, but give the audience a pitch.
Sure, absolutely. As always, Mr. Turnip Seed, thank you for the opportunity to come on over and talk to you about American history and sort of the curse of that odious neoconservatism that still rues the day in our age. You can find me over at findmyfriends.net/The Prudentialist on YouTube, Twitter, Telegram, and all places with podcast platforms. I cover international relations, culture, spiritual warfare, and I host a show every Thursday at 2:15 p.m. Eastern with our good friend Gio Panicetti called The Digital Archipelago. I am currently focusing on writing an essay on how to re-enchant the world. Hopefully I'll get some time, maybe even put it out later today, if not for sure on Monday. And other than that, just be on the lookout for a very lengthy conversation dropping between me and our good friends Dimes from Blood Satellite on the subject of communication in the digital age. We'll be going over Marshall McLuhan, Harold Innis, Hobson, and a few others. So it's going to be a really good time. Thank you, as always, Ryan, for having me on.
I'm very glad that you were able to make it, and I highly encourage everyone in the audience to go check out the work that Mr. Prudentialist puts out. He is an extremely thoughtful essayist, and his streams tend to be very entertaining, if not sometimes at the expense of his sanity. So go check him out. Grant Brooks, sir, I believe I have your Substack in the description, but why don't you give the audience a pitch as well?
Yeah, definitely check out my Substack. That's where I do most of my work. I write essays about Heritage America, the future, and some Bible commentary too. And that's where I direct everyone. You could also check out the streams that I have on this channel with Ryan. I'm particularly proud of the Bircher stream that we just did a few weeks ago.
As am I. That was probably one of my favorites of this since I've returned back to YouTube. Was the Bircher stream? And then John, sir, where can people find you? Give the pitch.
Yeah, my link tree's in the description. You can go subscribe to my YouTube channel. There'll probably be a new episode this week. It's like a variety show. It's lots of fun. You can also read my articles on the Old Glory Club. I'll probably write another one soon because it's almost the end of the month. So definitely check those out. Also, shout out to Mutant Number 12 in the chat. He's like our clip channel, and there's tons of great clips up there. Highly recommend you check out Mutant Number 12. So that's all I have to shill.
Yeah, fantastic, and that was a great point there, John. Every single person on this panel is affiliated in some way with the Old Glory Club, so you can go find all of our writings over at oldgloryclub.substack.com. I believe that I don't know that any of us specifically have put out something recent, but I do know for a fact that all of my panel members here have put out quite entertaining and hard-hitting essays before over there at the Old Glory Club. So go check them out. And also, if you are interested in getting sort of involved with the OGC, forming a chapter, joining a chapter if you're in New England or Virginia, by all means, email theoldgloryclub@gmail.com with your intentions. That is something that we are looking for. We want to get people actively involved in the OGC and in their locality. So with that, did anyone else have any last remarks before we sign off? Oh, there's another super chat that just came in. K. Lewis for $5. Thank you very much. He says, "Bruh, you started too early for a West Coaster. Here's some shekels. I'll watch the stream later." Thank you very much. I believe that for the West Coast, we start at 5:30 in the morning. So that is that's the joys of starting early on a Saturday morning with 3 time zones on the panel, maybe more. Who knows? So, with all that being said, thank you everyone here at the panel for joining me. It was quite enjoyable. So, with that, we will see everyone next week with Irving Kristol's Conservative Welfare State. Hopefully everyone is enjoying the Neoconservative series, and hopefully everyone can start to see that perhaps even the dissidents are not entirely uninfected by the lines of thought that we find in these neoconservative writings. So with that, I will see you all next week.